All right, is this on? Can you guys hear me? Yeah? All right. Let me restart my timer here and we'll get started. So, thank you for sticking it out toward the end of the day. I appreciate it. Thanks to the organizers for having me. It's always good to come back. I actually grew up right around here. I grew up in Henrietta, just a couple miles away. This hotel, I think I mentioned this last year, but this was the site of my high school senior prom in 1995. So, real weird vibes right now. I'll try to fight through it. It's good to see they haven't updated the carpet. That's nice. So, my talk today is called Catching More Flies, Spotting the Adversary with Honey Techniques. And this is not going to be a deeply technical presentation, but it's going to be more about some free and open tools that you can use in your environment as part of a larger strategy to catch malicious activity and potential adversaries. So first things first, who am I and what am I talking about? My name is Matt Gracie. I'm a senior engineer with Security Onion Solutions. Has anyone heard of Security Onion? It's an open source project. All right, awesome. So I mostly work in professional services and support. I do some training stuff as well. Before I started working for Security Onion, I was a blue teamer for about 15 years. I did defensive security in a whole lot of different places and a whole lot of different industries. I started off in higher ed, which is probably why I like free and open source products so much, because when you're in higher ed, you don't have any money. I also organized the BSides conference down in Buffalo, so if anybody wants to talk about that, feel free to pull my coat after the talk. What I'm going to be talking about today is using deception engineering or honey techniques as a high fidelity early warning indicator that there is something malicious going on your network. So what do I mean by deception engineering? Traditional detection engineering is writing alerts or writing detections around known malicious activities, right? Around indicators of potential compromise. Things like an IP address that has been linked to a C2, or things like a suricata rule that catches malicious traffic. If you see a cobalt strike beacon, you know that there's probably something bad going on, right? So it's written around these sort of universally recognized malicious activities that you want to raise an alert because, that's a sign that something nefarious is going on. Deception engineering, on the other hand, and this is kind of a fine distinction, but deception engineering is something specific to your environment. So instead of a generic rule that recognizes malicious traffic that says, hey, here's something beaconing out to a C2, you should probably investigate this. Deception engineering is building traps into your network, into your environment that are particular to your environment, that will appear to be innocuous traffic or innocuous activities to an attacker, but that you will recognize as being signs of something that's amiss, right? So you're kind of like, who's the kid in Home Alone? Anyone remember? What's that? Yeah, who's the character? Kevin. Right, you are Kevin from Home Alone, right? Joe Pesci, as always, is the bad guy. So you're building these tripwires and traps all through your environment so that when he trips over them, it makes a lot of noise and you recognize that he's there. One of the guys who wrote the book on honey techniques and honeypots, and I mean that literally, his last book was called Intrusion Detection Honeypots, is Chris Sanders, right? If you've been doing this for a while, you've probably run across Chris by now. And I really like this summary of how honey techniques and how deception engineering works. If you know where someone will look, so if you know where the attacker is going to look and how they're going to try to take advantage of your environment, you can control what they're going to see. And that's what we're going to talk about. How do we put tempting targets into the path of an attacker so that when they grab them, we get an alert? If you put something valuable there, you can control what they think. If they're doing reconnaissance internal to your network and you can control what they're going to see, you can probably control the path that they're going to take or the credentials that they're going to take advantage of when they get there. And if you can provide an opportunity If you can make something look vulnerable when it's not, if you can make something look tempting so that an attacker will grab it, then you can dictate what they're going to do. What's the old security aphorism, right? It's easier to be an attacker than a defender because defenders have to get lucky every time, and attackers, they have to get lucky once, right? That's sort of the old saw. You've heard that before? Okay. I'm sorry, I've had a lot of trouble reading people's expressions today for some reason. It's weird. But what this does is that kind of turns it onto their head. Sure, the attacker has to get lucky once. They have to get their initial access. They have to get into your network. But after that, they're basically stumbling around in your house with the lights turned off, right? You can set all the traps you want. That's what deception engineering is all about. Figuring out a way to instrument your environment so that when they're stumbling around in the dark, you can trip them up. I'm sure you've seen this before. This is the sort of list of MITRE attack tactics, the phases of MITRE's version of the kill chain, right? So where does deception engineering help us out? Well, it can help us in a lot of the early phases. Wow, that is almost unreadable. I apologize. If somebody is doing reconnaissance, we can instrument things on our border so that even if they're not valid targets, they might be something that an attacker would enumerate, and then we're able to raise an alert and say, hey, somebody is scanning our border, somebody is trying to find their way in, get some intelligence on that. If they're looking at things like lateral movement, right, we can put traps around accounts, around credentials, so that if they're poking around and they compromise some credentials somewhere, when they try to use them, we get alerted to it. We can do the same thing with this privilege escalation phase, right? If they're trying to move up to an administrative account or a super user account of some kind, we can build fake ones and then raise alerts when somebody tries to use them. If they try to move around the network using various escalation techniques, we can build tripwires here, there, and everywhere, right? Our whole goal here is to make them waste their time, make them double guess themselves, make them very hesitant to do things that appear to be harmless, right? We're not talking about those cobalt strike beacons going out. We're just talking about using some stolen credentials to log into a DC. But we want to make all of these very high risk, high alert actions so that they're never quite sure whether their footing is secure. So it sounds like fun, and it is. There are some prerequisites in your security program that you really need to have in place before you start trying to deploy this stuff, though. So I just kind of want to step through these and talk about, where you need to be. For one thing, you're going to need an asset inventory. I know it's the #1 control in the top 20. I know it's something that we're all terrible at. But you need at least a rudimentary asset inventory because you need to know how to make things that look real but are actually booby traps in your environment. And you need to know how to put them somewhere where your actual users won't stumble over them, right? You need to be able to make these things plausible, but unless they are in a spot where your users won't get to them but an attacker will, they're not going to be very good high fidelity alerts. If Barb from payroll keeps tripping your honeypots, it's not going to work out for you. You're just going to waste a lot of time with false positives. You need to have some centralized logging in place. And the reason for this is when a honey alert goes off, you need to be able to figure out where it is and why. A lot of these are alerts that may go out to a website or some other clearinghouse, right? So you may not have the actual IP address of the workstation where something was tripped. You may only have your border IP address. You need to have this logging in place so that you can say, okay, this fired at this time. I'm going to go back through my workstation logs and figure out what exactly happened and where, right? You need to have that context so that when you get these alerts, you can investigate them. Otherwise, no matter how high fidelity they are, they're not going to do you any good, right? You're just going to say, well, something went wrong on my network somewhere. So that's not going to be great. You need to have some sort of alerting function. right? When these things fire, you need to have some sort of console or some sort of SOC or some sort of board or Slack channel or email list or something so that people know that it fired. Otherwise, no one's going to see it happen, no one's going to investigate. And then finally, you also need to have an incident response or an investigation plan, right? And ideally, you want to drill on this. You want to practice, you want to make sure that you know how to hunt this stuff down. If somebody uses a particular account, right, to talk about one potential hunting technique, if somebody logs in with a particular account, you need to have the facilities in place to say, okay, I know where they logged in from, I got the alert that they logged in, I know how to investigate it, and I know how to figure out where that login came from, right? You need all of these components in order to receive and take advantage of the alert. If you just try to jump right into, scattering canary tokens or whatever across your environment and you don't have any of this stuff in place to provide larger context, it's going to be frustrating for you, right? So you need to get the fundamentals in place first. So the first variety of hunting technique that I'm going to talk about are canary tokens. Canary tokens are an open source product. The project is at canarytokens.org. It's run by Thinkst-Canary. Canary tokens are really nice because they're simple, they're easy to deploy. It's all set up as a hosted service if you like. If you're not comfortable with putting all this stuff into the hands of a free hosted service, all of the backend stuff is up on GitHub. You can download it and run your own service layer that receives the alerts from these canary tokens. The setup is very simple. This is just a screenshot of my browser. I was getting an AWS key token, right? So all I do is I put in some information about the token, a reminder of where it's going to go or where I'm going to deploy it or what it means if I get an alert about this. And I put in an email address or a webhook. Then I log in, and if you're familiar with AWS, you know what a credentials file is. I get a credentials file with a set of valid AWS credentials in it. Then I can take that credentials file and I can put it somewhere in my environment where an attacker might see it, but where a developer is not going to, right? I could put it on somebody's workstation in accounting or marketing or something like that, somewhere that it will look like a tempting target, but my developers aren't accidentally going to try to submit anything to AWS with it. And then you wait. If that AWS account is accessed, then the email address or the webhook that you put in during instantiation time will receive an alert. And the alert looks like this. See, it says canary token triggered, the channel by which it was triggered, the time, the name of the canary token, that long sort of Unicode string there, the reminder, that is the note that I put in there when I created the token token type, in this case AWS keys, the IP, and because it's an HTTP token, the user agent. So to trigger this token, I created it, I downloaded it to a Linux machine, and I tried to use it with the AWS CLI tool to enumerate S3 buckets, right? I did like the most simple possible recon task with these credentials, and I immediately got an email. The AWS ones can take a couple minutes because it has to kind of filter through the AWS pipeline, but again, very swift, very high fidelity alert. I put this somewhere and someone is trying to use it. No one legitimately should be trying to use this, so that means that there's probably someone in my network doing something that they oughtn't to be. Either a very curious employee or more likely a pen tester or an adversary of some sort. So that's AWS keys, right? That is a pretty simple, straightforward use case. But there's a lot of different canary token varieties available. You can use AWS keys. You can do the same thing with Azure. So there's an Azure analog to that where anybody trying to access Azure services with the credentials that you've provided will raise an alert. There are a couple of different varieties of Office documents that this is available for. They use a tracking pixel technology, so when somebody opens up a Word document or an Excel document, It tries to pull down an image from the Canary Token's web server, which recognizes it as, hey, somebody just opened this document, and sends you an email or sends you a webhook, a Slack. Canary tokens can be set to trigger on DNS lookups. So if you have unused IP space in your network, for example, and you want it to trigger if somebody starts trying to do reverse lookups against it, you can do that. You can instrument specific Windows EXEs. So if you want to put something on your system that will trigger every time somebody runs PowerShell or runs WhoAmI or runs NetUser, right? Stuff that you would not expect your normal users to do, but you want visibility into it if some adversary is doing it as a means of lateral movement, you can set that up as well. The web redirects, I think, is one of my favorite ones. You can set up a canary token for a non-existent service on your border. Like say you want to stand up, vpn.example.com, and then it will capture information about the browser, the originating IP, the source geography, etc., and then redirect it to wherever you want. So it can act as sort of a harvesting agent while somebody is trying to do reconnaissance against your network. And you'll get all that information in the alert from the canary tokens. They just added the ability to do credit card numbers, which I thought was pretty cool. You can set up a perfectly valid, passes all the algorithmic checks credit card number, interleave it in with actual production data, or leave it in a spreadsheet on somebody's laptop. And if anybody tries to use that credit card number and actually charge against it, you'll get a canary token alert, right? That will tell you that that data source has been compromised, that number is being used. And the last one here, which I think is really cool, WireGuard profiles. So you guys are familiar with WireGuard, sort of a VPN-ish platform, right? So you can create a WireGuard profile that's a canary token, so when somebody attempts to connect to it using those profile settings, it'll raise an alert. The neat thing about this, which I didn't really appreciate when they rolled it out, is you can put a WireGuard profile on a computer, yes, but you can also put it on a phone. So if you can generate these for people and push them out via your MDM solution or have people manually install them on portable devices, this can be a really good high fidelity indicator that somebody's phone has been compromised. Now, I don't know about you, but over the course of my career, that's been a really hard thing to ascertain, right? We don't have nearly the level of visibility and telemetry into people's mobile devices that we do into their laptops and desktops and VMs. So, this is a really good indicator if somebody has compromised their phone and they're trying to use it as a pivot point, or they're trying to use that WireGuard profile to access your corporate data, that something is amiss and somebody's phone just got popped, right? And again, all these canary tokens can be freely generated at canarytokens.org. If you would prefer to run your own infrastructure, you can totally do that. There's a link at canarytokens.org to their GitHub that has all of the backend services available. You can run it in your own cloud or in your own data center. But if you generate a bunch of these canary tokens, especially if you're thorough and methodical in the tags that you put on them, so you know exactly where they are when one fires, and if you've got the logging infrastructure in place in order to investigate the stuff properly, this can be a really great way to just kind of scatter traps around your network where your users will never notice it, but somebody enumerating your data or trying to pivot or laterally move through your network is bound to trip over one or another, right? So super, super handy set of tools. Does anyone have questions at this point? No? All right. There'll be a link at the end. I'll post the slides too, so don't feel like you have to take pictures of them. All right. Another helpful technique that we can use is honey docs or honey documents, right? You build a file, you put it on a file share, you name it something like payroll data or employee evaluations or Q4 fiscal plan, right? You can even do this with a canary token spreadsheet. You can take one of those Excel spreadsheets that was generated by the canary token site, put some data in it, stick it up on a file share somewhere. Get the hash of the file. If you're running Zeek in your environment, or you're running some other network monitoring platform with Zeek-like functionality, preferably Zeek, You can just take that hash and put a Intel rule in place that will alert you if that file is moved or accessed, right? So you've basically just set up a big fat target, and like the tweet from Chris Sanders said, if somebody sees that, they're probably going to try to open it, they're probably going to try to retrieve it, they're probably going to try to do something to it. So you make it look as innocuous as possible, and then you build a bunch of controls around it, so if anybody touches it, you get alerted. They don't necessarily get zapped, they just get some fake information. But you are now alerted that somebody is accessing that network, is accessing that file share, and is trying to pull down data that they should not be looking at, right? If you want to, you can even layer these techniques. So not only do you create it as a canary token, you write a Zeek Intel rule, so when it moves across the network, you know about it. You can also use your EDR platform or Sysmon or whatever you're using in your endpoint logs and write an alert for it there too. So if they see this file hash being written to disk anywhere, you'll capture where it came from, you'll capture where it was written to, you'll capture all the user information around this data being pilfered, right? And you'll know right where they are and right what they're doing with your data. Really handy technique. Another one is using honey creds or honey credentials. You create a domain account, you name it something like webadmin, right? Something that sounds very highly privileged. You can even create an Active Directory group to put it in, right? Something that's not quite built in, but you want to name it something like Apache Administrators or something like that. Give it no valid login hours. So the account can't actually be used for anything. It just sits there looking tempting. So tempting. Then you put the credentials into a honey doc somewhere, right? Somewhere that an attacker is likely to see it, but a user is not. So you put a spreadsheet on a developer's desktop, you put it on a file server, you put it in your LastPass vault. Sorry. Somewhere that's going to be very visible. And then you can just build an alert around that. So if you see anybody trying to log in with this account, if you see anybody trying to authenticate with it, raise an alert. Again, if you've got your centralized logging in place, if you've got your investigative capacity in place, once somebody does this, you should see the Windows event fire that someone's trying to log in with this account, and you'll know exactly where from. If you want to get really fancy, there's a technique I found where you can actually just seed the credentials into memory using run as, right? Then if somebody comes along later and they run Mimikatz or something else to try to dump out the process memory and get that password, they will be able to retrieve the information and use it to log in, not suspecting that this is just a fake account that you set up to trap them, but rather thinking, oh, this is great. I logged into the web server. There's this web admin account that was logged in. I could steal the password for it and just go nuts, right? Again, our point here is to build traps. We're trying to build things that will tempt an attacker, that will look like innocuous activity, but will actually alert us in the background that something terrible is going on and that we need to investigate. Two more that I found when I was doing some research for this talk. These both came from NCC Group, which I thought was interesting. So these were honey techniques that were built off of threat intelligence that was being used in the wild. One was the Windows process killed canary, which watched the service and process table in a Windows server and alerted when a certain number of services were killed. Why is that useful? Because a lot of ransomware starts with killing off services, right? It kills things like the volume shadow copy, it kills things like the EDR service, etc. So they said if you monitor those particular services that get killed by this variety of ransomware, then you will have an early warning system. Before the ransomware even executes, you'll see those services getting killed and you'll know that something nasty is going on, right? Again, you're not looking specifically for anything malicious. You're not building something that your regular users are going to run afoul of, but you're taking the threat intelligence and you're saying, doing this thing that normally would not raise an alert will, because we know that it's something bad. The other one was the Windows uninstaller canary, which I thought was really clever. So there was another variety of ransomware. I think it might have been Ryuk, but I'm not positive. The link's at the end of the presentation. And the first thing it did was it ran a script that said, okay, uninstall CrowdStrike, uninstall Sentinel-1, uninstall, what's that one BlackBerry makes now? Cylance. Uninstall Cylance. Uninstall Defender, right? Run all of these uninstalls. So they said, well, what if we just create a dummy process and we call it CrowdStrike? And we put it out across our fleet. It's not actually going to do anything. It's not going to hurt anything having it out there. It's basically just an idle process spinning its wheels. But if this ransomware comes along, what's the first thing it's going to do? Kill the CrowdStrike process. What's that going to do? It's going to alert us, right? Because we jumped in front of its process. It's trying to kill all this stuff off, and then we can raise an alert and know, okay, there's no legitimate reason why anybody should be doing anything to our fake CrowdStrike process. We run Defender anyway. But if we see a intruder out there who's killing these things off, that's an excellent early warning system for us that something nefarious is going on, right? So those are the kind of, mix and match honey techniques that you can use in your existing environment. One last possibility that I want to talk about is instead of using a file or using an account or using an AWS credentials file, what if we make the whole server into a trap, right? So this is what Chris wrote the book on last year, Intrusion Detection Honeypots. So the idea is we stand up an entire fake server to act as a target. Again, there's no legitimate reason why any of our users, any of the people who have a reason to be on our network should find this. But we can just spin up a VM, stick it in a corner of the network, make it available to an attacker who's running Nmap or running some reconnaissance tool to figure out what other services are available. And then if anybody messes with it, we raise an alert. If someone tries to log into it, we record what credentials they tried to use, right? So we're setting this whole thing up as sort of a Potemkin server, if you will, and just record what they do to it, not return anything good, and use it to gather information about the attacker. Now, the difference between this and a research honeypot is a research honeypot is generally something that's run exposed to the internet at large, right? And the idea behind a research honeypot is to do research and figure out attacker techniques. I stand up an MS SQL server, I expose it to the internet, I wait the 35 seconds it takes to get pwned, and then I go through the logs and try to figure out what exactly happened. That's a research honeypot. In this case, we're talking about an intrusion detection honeypot. We set this up inside our enterprise network. We try to emulate another server or another service that exists on our network, and then we just wait for somebody to interact with it and try to figure out what's going on. Whenever there's any kind of interaction, we raise an alert, and then you can investigate. And because, again, your network is instrumented, you've got proper logging in place, you've got a proper investigative capacity, you can go in and figure out, all right, who reached out, who touched it, whose account was responsible, and so on. Security Onion, the platform that I support, has an intrusion detection honeypot node available. This is something that we released, I think, last year. That's built, again, around Thinkst, their Open Canary platform. So when you install one of these intrusion detection honeypots, and the overhead for these is incredibly small. I mean, it's like one processor and 2 gigs of RAM. You could run one of these in a VM on just about every endpoint in your network and not even notice. But when you install it, you have a variety of sort of prepackaged servers that you can emulate. You could say, I want this to look like a Linux web server. You can say, I want this to look like a MySQL server. I want this to look like a Microsoft SQL server. Whatever you pick, it will configure the ports accordingly, expose them to the internal network. Things like port 80 for a web server, or port 1433 for a MySQL server. To all intents and purposes, it will look like one of these appliances serving to your internal network. But really what it's doing is recording any attempt to connect to it and then raising alerts in the central Security Onion alert console. By default, if you install this Linux web server here, this is what it looks like. It looks like a NAS product with a login window in it, right? It does not have to look like this. We actually support reskinning it with any HTTP you want to use. I was playing around with that capability when I was prepping this talk, and I just did a wget on some other enterprise product, copied out the login page, stuck it in there, and it looked exactly the same, right? So if you're using some other web product internally, if you want to make it look like the login window for your Tenable scanner, you want to make it look like the login window for your SAN or for some other internal product, you can totally do that. Give it a host name that just about matches, stand it up, and just wait to see what happens. It actually generates 2 different classes of alert by default. They're very interesting because they are unreadably small, but they're very good alerts. It will raise one class of alert if anyone connects to the HTTP port at all. So if there's any network traffic that touches port 80, it will raise an alert and say, hey, somebody touched this. That can be a good indicator that somebody is doing a port scan, or if you put a DNS record in it, somebody might have done a zone transfer and be going through trying to touch everything, trying to figure out what's going on. There is a second alert that occurs if somebody actually tries to log into it. So if they go into this interface and actually put in a username or a username and password and they hit login, they'll just get a login failed dialog, obviously, but it will record the username and the password that they used. So if somebody is trying to use credentials to move laterally or to log into other services or to log into other web applications, it will light up clear as day right here, and you'll say, oh, okay, this person obviously compromised this account over here. So again, really good indicator early in the kill chain that somebody is doing something nasty, that they're trying to do some lateral movement, that they're trying to use stolen credentials to move around inside your environment. But it's easy to set up, it's free, it's super high fidelity, and it does not inconvenience your users. It's really a win-win if you've got the time to put in to stand it all up. So in conclusion, just a couple other tweets that I really liked. One is from Swift on Security, right? To defeat attackers, you got to bring them down to your level and just beat the hell out of them with it. Absolutely true. Again, we always say, well, the attackers only have to get lucky once. No, they have to get lucky every time. We have to make them worry that every time they touch something inside our network, it's probably a trap, right? And by using techniques like this, you can do that, and it's free. Second, David Weston, who's a VP of security at Microsoft, says, don't play their game, make them play yours, right? If they're going to come into our network and they're going to start touching our stuff, we need to make that much more difficult, right? And doing stuff like this so that we get warned right away that something nefarious is going on, that's a really good way to do that. All right? So that's all the slides that I have. If anyone has any questions, let me know. Again, I'll post these up on my GitHub later on. If you want to follow me on Twitter, there's my handle, there's my email address. I guess that's it. Oh, and when I post the slides, there's the links to the stuff that I footnoted as well. All right. Any questions? Once I close my laptop, it's all over. What's up? Not that I have run across. It sounds like using log4j as a token, which I like. If everything's broken anyway, we might as well get some use out of it. No, that's a really cool idea. I like that. I haven't seen it, but it sounds awesome. Anyone else?
I don't know if it's a stupid question, but I was going to ask, has the choice to leave, say, hey, this is what's going on, I'm leaving, or they can become persistent if they don't know that this is a honeypot, and then at the end of the day, they find out that, hey, this is a trap, I need to leave, or whatever the case may be. Do you know of anything that an attacker will do once they identify, hey, this is a honeypot, or?
Well, I think the idea is if you're deploying these liberally, they're probably going to run across them before they realize it's a honeypot, right? They're gonna walk through the tripwire and hear it click, like in every good 1980s action film. As for how they'll react to that, I suppose it would depend on the attacker. I mean, the nice thing here is with stuff like the Windows Service Canary or the Uninstaller Canary is whether they stick around or not, we've gotten an alert about this this nefarious behavior before they're able to really complete the compromise, right? We caught them partway through prepping to deploy the ransomware. They didn't actually get to do it. So whether they try to stick around and we kick them out or whether they realize that something is up and they leave on their own, either way our stuff didn't get ransomed. So. Yeah.
Have you ever run into, because all these canaries require the network communication to send the alert out. Like, have you ever run into attackers trying to block that before the process canary, before they start killing the process loops? Have you saw anything where they would indicate they try to block network traffic out that would be indicative of a canary being tripped?
I have not. That's an interesting thought, but I think it would be hard for an attacker to, A, recognize that that's something that they're walking into, and B, kill off the network access that granularly, right? It just seems like it'd be really easy for them to lock their keys in the car.
Thinks Canary with their SaaS solution.
Oh, okay, so you're saying just block responses specifically to Thinkst?
Right. Well, as the example, because that's where
Yeah. Yeah, no, I haven't seen that, but it's an interesting thought. Yeah.
Hopefully not too off the beaten path. The credit card thing is really interesting to me. Do you have any idea how they would actually alert and trigger that? Like, there has to be some.
I don't know how it works on the back end. They just announced it like a couple weeks ago. I thought it was really cool, so I wanted to put it in there. Okay, so it happens at like the clearinghouse level when they try to process the number?
Yep, there's a certain range of numbers that they have.
Nice. I wonder if the bad guys have figured out the range yet.
They were saying that they're trying to get more partners in as well. So if they could partner with credit cards, so we have this not just at this level, but if they have where the credit card out, they can give you an extra credit card number, and they kind of alert you from the credit card itself that maybe you can compromise, and they alert you to try and go through that route too.
Oh, interesting.
And there are legitimate uses for these too, because I think it's private that allows you to generate virtual credit card numbers that are valid credit card numbers, but you can lock them down to certain vendors.
Right, or
So
certain
there's a
certain
whole
amounts,
bunch of
yeah.
new, kind of these new virtual credit cards. So it's, I'm assuming a virtual credit card number that Thinks is doing as well. That is just for them to use.
Mhm. Yeah, credit card numbers seem like they have the same security limitations as social security numbers, where it's like, this is something you need to keep secret. Also, we would like you to tell it to everybody. So it's, it's kind of trying to shoot the horse once it's already out the barn.
Credit card numbers just have a basic text
Right.
validation, and then after the validation, whether or not there's actually an account connection. Because I remember seeing previously, there's like test credit numbers, that if you're developing software that takes credit card numbers, you can have a set of numbers that both generate a fail and a set of numbers that generate a pass, so that you can validate that your software is properly processing.
Nice. Like iCar for MasterCard.
They're
Right.
probably just adding some tracking levels onto that to see if
That makes sense. Any, any other questions? All right, well, if you think of any, I will be around. Thanks.